Welcome to this module on the definition of the phenomenon of gender-based violence. My name is Rosa Monachelli. I'm a psychologist, psychotherapist and birth attendant for the association Il Melograno in Rome. I have been working for many years with this association for different projects that aim at promoting the health and well-being of women and men who are about to become parents or that have just become parents with their histories, their life experiences, their needs, their difficulties, but also with their resources and skills. Let me briefly tell you a personal episode about the beginning of my work as birth attendant. I got to know the violence during pregnancy at that time, in particular in 2007 with a project for migrant women. It was a project named Donne Migranti e Nascita, so migrant women and birth. And there was a young Nigerian lady who told me to have been a victim of violence during pregnancy and the fact that violence didn't stop even after childbirth. After that moment, we started to work with that woman, and I started to work on myself because I was not expert. I had no tools and no specific skills, competencies at that time. And I remember a specific moment, a specific story that the woman told me. She said that after being victim of violence, she once went to the ER, and the health professional there understood immediately that something had happened. She was aching, so she was very sensitive to pain, and however, she decided not to tell anything about what had happened. And this story makes me once again understand how fundamental it was to work together with other people to sharing experiences that makes you richer and more competent. I know that I'm talking to people that are already expert and that are well prepared in the field. However, I thought it was important to share with you some specific experiences, to find common languages and to deal in the best way with the problem of violence during pregnancy. What will we see in this module, in this section? First of all, some documents and reports to have a general overview, a general framework of the different forms of violence. We will talk about stereotypes that are related to violence and also some data on violence in pregnancy in particular, and data on violence in general. First of all, let's start with the phenomenon of violence and refer to a document of the WHO, a document that was published in 2002, the World Report on Violence and Health, that defined violence against women as a health problem of huge global proportions. And figures tell us that the incidence is very high, both for mother and children. And there are some implications, long-lasting implications of violence, both on health and on the social and psychological development of children, of families, communities, and whole countries. And the consequences have some very heavy effects on the services provided in terms of public health care. There is an estimated expenditure, an estimated cost of 226 billion euros per year in Europe. And so the costs are too high. This report tells us that preventing violence is a priority for public health, both for these too high health costs, but also for the high costs of the services involved. The report also specifies that it is very important to define the position of health professionals that are very often in a particularly advantageous position and play a key role when dealing with women who were victims of violence. They are generally the only professionals who have the chance to realize what is happening, and they are very authoritative figures in the communities with an important impact both on the people themselves and on the communities. Violence is also one of the causes of a disease and of suffering, so it needs to be taken into consideration when dealing with women in healthcare. So the WHO talked about a huge impact, a huge proportion of violence. Violence represents a traumatic experience suffered by over 35% of women worldwide. And according to the report published by the WHO in 2018, on sexual, physical abuse, we are told that very often violence is inflicted by a partner. But let's have a look at the definitions and the terminology about violence. Let me share with you these three definitions. Maria Luisa Bonora observed that these three definitions refer to a specific element of the problem, each of them. So first, domestic violence. All international data agree on the fact that all over the world, women suffer violence, are victims of violence, especially within domestic walls. That should be the most protective, the safest context. Instead, in case of violence in relationships, so intimate partner violence, it is to be highlighted that women are victims of violence mainly within the couple, and the violence is perpetrated by partners or ex-partners. And these definitions help us define where violence occurs, and there are some limits in terms of specificity, because if we look at the general definition of violence, violence might be also against underage children, against women, by men, on behalf of men, but also vice versa. So all these expressions are related to violence, but they do not tell us anything about the roots and the origin of the problem. And so a definition of gender violence was also given for a more general framework. This expression means that there is not only violence from men against women, but there can be sexist types of violence, and there was the concept of gender included in the international definitions. Gender violence is an international definition that has been used also thanks to a very long work that was done to get to the Istanbul Convention. As for the Istanbul Convention that many of you will surely know, I would like to dwell a little bit upon Article 3, where violence against women is to be understood as a violation of human rights and a form of discrimination against all women. And it shall mean all acts of gender-based violence that result in physical, sexual, psychological or economic harm or suffering for women, including threats of such acts, coercion or arbitrary deprivation of liberty in public or in private life. So this article defines very clearly what should be included in the forms of violence and in the definition of violence. And so the article, as you can see here, also includes a definition of domestic violence, and it also specifies what the word gender means, that is, socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities and attributes that a given society considers to be appropriate for women and men. And again, the article defines gender-based violence against women, which means violence directed against a woman because she's a woman, or that affects women disproportionately. So this also includes an idea of the data, the figures related to gender-based violence. The Istanbul Convention was adopted by the Council of Europe in 2011. Since the 11th of May 2011, that is when the convention was presented in Istanbul, the convention has been signed by 44 countries, but there are still many countries who are to ratify the document. The countries involved in the project, we saw that Italy signed in 2012 and the convention entered into force in 2014. Greece and Spain signed in 2011, Slovenia in 2015, Bulgaria in 2016, but it has not entered into force there. So, considering this delay in the ratification and in the implementation in the different countries, well, there can be many reasons behind that. First of all, we know that economic resources are needed, and so not all countries can afford this. And on the other side, there is sometimes a problem of culture, because the definition of gender is often considered ideologically, and this might go against the beliefs and the main ideals of one specific country. However, this is the innovative aspect of the convention, that is, recognizing the cultural and social roots and origins of violence. Now, let's have a look at the different types of violence existing and recognized. The first part of the list mentions what I have already talked about when referring to the Istanbul Convention. So sexual violence, physical violence, psychological violence, economic violence and stalking. And then on the other side of the list, there are other types of violence. Some of these have been recognized as violence, whereas some of these practices are accepted by some countries because they are related to their cultural traditions, and so they are still accepted today, such as forced marriage or early marriage, female genital mutilation, the inheritability of the wife, selective and forced abortions, and when referring to migration, there is the trafficking of women and girls for sexual exploitation. And another form of violence that has been recognized is obstetric violence. Obstetric violence is often mentioned, and it was defined for the first time by an act, a piece of law passed in Venezuela, Article 15 of 2007, which defined obstetric violence as the appropriation of the body and the reproductive processes by the healthcare professionals that used too much medications or engendered the loss of autonomy of the woman and the possibility of deciding of its life, having a very negative impact on the life of the woman itself. And then the gender-based mobbing. Going on with the definition of violence, there's another aspect that we should consider carefully, that is not minimizing violence as just a couple conflict or an unhappy relationship, because very often violence against the partner is not at all a couple conflict or just the fact of losing control. First, using the word conflict presumes that there is consensus to the dispute on both sides. Whereas in an intimate partner violence, there is no consensus. There is almost always one side prevailing over the other, and one of the two is constantly controlled by the other. And so this is an aspect that may help us say if there is intimate partner violence, that is observing who fears whom. So what, let's say, side is afraid of the other. Daniele Lovara is a researcher that has been studying conflicts and has always underlined that violence is not only conflict, because conflict has to do with the relational side of things, whereas violence has to do with destruction, with the destruction of the relationship itself, with the inhibition of the relationship. So conflict can be like a training moment in the relationship that may create some distance, but it can be positive, which is totally different from violence, which is destructive. Talking about violence, gender and stereotypes, so we noticed that gender inequality was included in the Istanbul Convention, but we know that it is very important to observe the various behaviors with a gender-based approach. That is a method allowing us to analyze reality, highlighting the differences and inequalities between genders. The word gender refers to a process. That is the way we create ourselves as men or women during social coexistence, and sometimes implying some men or women-based behaviors that the society promotes. And so there are some roles, behaviors and expectations that are assigned in different cultures and that lead to gender and power hierarchies. So gender-based violence can be considered as an expression of these hierarchies, and at the same time an expression of inequalities. But what are the tools that we can use to fight against this, to identify the phenomenon and work against it? The WHO gives us some indications about the fact that it is very important to deal with care with a gender-based approach. So the health care for the victims of violence should involve a women-centered approach, and so it should be gender sensitive and also shared, because the decisions must be made with the women, and gender sensitive because it needs to pay attention to the gender issue, meaning that healthcare professionals must be aware of the impact that gender and discriminations, expectations, stereotypes might have on women's lives. And so this should be taken into account when approaching the victims. And the WHO underlines that the healthcare professionals, the staff, all the operators working in hospitals, but also the technical staff, administrative staff, should be trained on this. And as for the gender stereotypes that are commonly used, there are some sentences that women could hear and that men will not hear or hardly ever hear, such as, "Are you traveling alone? Aren't you afraid?" Or for those who do not have children, people think that they should have, or if they have children, will you continue to work after giving birth? So there are several stereotypes connected to that. And these sentences would be meaningless if, used with a man, and they are based on the female gender instead. And so gender stereotypes are related to rigid cultural definitions of both men and women, related to the culture and generally what we should expect from a man or a woman, or what kind of emotions and behaviors might be considered as appropriate or acceptable. This is a definition that was taken from the book by Maria Luisa Bonora, where there was also this definition of stereotypes, gender stereotypes that represent for our lives as women and men something similar to water for a fish. That is a background of which we are not aware, but within which we move and we make our choices. This clearly defines that these cultural ideas related to men and women lead us to, create sort of cages that trap our potentials both as men and women. Let me conclude on stereotypes by asking you a question that was asked by a young feminist activist that wondered, what if in raising children we focus on ability instead of gender? And what if we focus on interest instead of gender? And so, to conclude on stereotypes, we know that it is fundamental to measure how the stereotypes and to what extent the stereotypes are widespread, because this would be important to interpret the cultural context that legitimates inequalities and where there are violent behaviors that are somehow justified. And so this makes some behaviors either plausible or not acceptable for a woman. Now let's look at some figures about the dimension of the phenomenon of violence against women. Here there are some of the main figures, and in the most recent ones, in particular the ones by the WHO. This 2018 report indicated that overall in the world, about 1 woman out of 3 have been subject to physical or sexual violence from a husband or a partner, and over 1/4 of women aged between 15 and 49 have been subjected to violence from a partner at least once, and 38% of all women that are killed worldwide have been killed by intimate partners. Whereas the percentage of women who have been subjected to sexual violence from a known partner is lower, and the figures are not complete and are more difficult to get. As for the figures on this kind of violence, it is clear that the violence of men against women is the most common. Again, in the 2018 WHO report, there was an overview taken from the global database on the prevalence of violence against women. And so this is on the WHO website where the figures coming from the different countries are updated. This data mainly refer to violence against women by a partner. So globally we talk about 27%, 23% in Europe, and as for our countries, we rank between 16 and 19%. There's another snapshot at a European level. In 2021, an agency of the European Union for Fundamental Human Rights conducted a survey to let's say, identify people who suffered violence in the year before the research. And so any kind of people irrespective of the gender. Over 2 million people were subject to physical violence. So again, irrespective of the gender. But more specifically, the research showed another aspect which is important to underline. That is, the episodes of physical violence are very different if, let's say, aimed at men or aimed at women. Very often, violence against men happens in the public, in roads, parks, open air spaces, whereas physical violence against women happens most of the times within one's walls, so in women's homes. It was also showed that very often men are victim of violence perpetrated by strangers, people that they don't know, whereas women suffer from violence perpetrated by partners or people that they know. And so the difference is mainly underline that there is an impact of this on justice. For example, the event is reported to the police and it needs to be witnessed by some testimonies, and so there are differences also in the justice procedures. So it is very important to support the gender approach in the interpretation of the phenomena. Here are other figures related to the COVID-19 pandemic, and in particular the first lockdown period, so with the restrictions, showing us that things were much worse in that period. A lot of researchers have talked about an emergency within emergency, because women suffered from violence even more during the pandemic, and it was like a hidden crisis. So the restrictions to limit the spreading of the virus did not help at all the conditions of women and of families. So there were social and economic crises triggered by the emergency of the pandemic. And so women's organizations noticed a significant increase in the number of violence cases against women. So violence against women has increased, but it was very difficult to collect data because very often there were some limitations during the pandemic, and so it was even more difficult to identify the phenomenon. But UN Women showed that the situation of women in 13 countries was this one, that is 3 women in 10 suffered from violence, and in particular 1 in 2 women reported directed violence during the pandemic. There was verbal, but also physical violence, sexual violence. And sex in 10 women said that they think that sexual harassment in public has worsened, and almost 7 in 10 think that domestic violence increased during the pandemic. And in many cases, there were requests for shelter and for support, but very often these requests couldn't be met because there were limitations and restrictions. So this situation was similar to what happened in Italy. Istat in 2021 highlighted that in 2020, 15,000 women started to, work to get out, let's say, of the situation of violence. But 74% of these women were already victim of violence before the pandemic. And so they were in great danger. There was also an increase in child abuse and mistreatment. You will find a remark by the Association of Pediatricians in the report that underlined that in cases of crisis, emergencies, there are important repercussions, both at an economic level, because people lost their job, and at social level. So the cases of violence at home have increased, not only against women, but also against children. Now, let's focus on the data on violence during pregnancy. First of all, an introduction to our project, the project that we have conducted. We realized that it's not easy to collect data on violence in pregnancy. It is very difficult to know the percentage on the overall number of pregnancies. We can estimate on the cases worldwide, and the data are around from 0.9% to 1.2%, whereas in other cases they talk about 3.8 to 3.9%. However, there was no big difference between industrialized and non-industrialized countries, because violence against women is present all over the world. More specifically, talking about the intimate partner violence during pregnancy, well, this has been found to be associated with adverse health outcomes that can be either fatal or non-fatal for the woman and the baby. It's due to a direct trauma or psychological effects from the current or past abuse on fetal growth and development. According to the WHO in 2011, and its report of 2011, intimate partner violence during pregnancy is to be considered very carefully, especially the data, because they highlighted that the intimate partner violence is mainly considered as physical, whereas other kinds of abuses can be very harmful both for women and for their babies. Talking about physical violence, one of the most worrying thing during pregnancy is when an abusive partner targets a woman's abdomen, hurting not only the woman but also jeopardizing the pregnancy itself, so the fetus or the baby. This chart, which was also included in the WHO studies, shows the prevalence of intimate partner violence during pregnancy. This report dated back to 2021, and it showed that we go from 1% in Japan to 28% in Peru, and most of the countries range between 4 and 12%. It is important to underline that this only included physical violence, but it's very difficult to say if this kind of data can be reliable, considering that it's really difficult to identify the phenomenon of violence during pregnancy. As I have already mentioned when talking about the cultural approach and the gender-based violence, it is very difficult to identify a phenomenon when there are stereotypes, not to mention when a woman is pregnant. So on one hand, very few report the act, and on the other, the operators, the professionals, have difficulties in identifying this kind of situation. Other data on violence in pregnancy. So this is a 2014 report by the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, and it measured violence suffered from women in 28 member states. This research, this survey, was conducted among women who had suffered violence in previous years and in that year, and 42% of women who had suffered from violence in pregnancy said that they had suffered violence with the previous partners, whereas 20% says with the current partner during pregnancy. These figures are also, dependent on the fact that during the interview, the woman find it hard to report the violence she had suffered. However, the data show that violence doesn't stop during pregnancy. This is the main point. Let me give you other data of ISTAT, the Italian National Institute for Statistics. It was a report of 2014, and these figures were very helpful for us because they made us realize and confirm that in cases of women who have experienced the partner violence during pregnancy, most of them had already suffered from violence before. And the intensity of violence during pregnancy increased for 11% of people, whereas for 5.7% the violence began again during pregnancy. So this shows that violence does not save pregnancy. Pregnancy is not to be considered a protection for a woman, because figures show very clearly that pregnancy is not some sort of protective shield, unfortunately. On the contrary. The woman is maybe more vulnerable, is maybe less independent during this period, and this is perceived by the partner as an opportunity to dominate, to control the woman. What I have said in this module is not totally exhaustive because there are not all the surveys or full research that has been conducted, but this shows that it is very difficult to identify cases of violence during pregnancy and before childbirth. And something that really impressed me, struck me when I was reading the report, is that it is so difficult to find data, even though all healthcare services follow pregnant women, because violence in pregnancy is not very often reported, and it is not even mentioned in the legal framework providing for some specific actions. Thank you very much for your attention.